What I want to spend a little bit of time today is talking about what my most successful and happy clients are doing differently than a lot of those other folks that are out there. I'm excited about today's video because it allows me to expand and dive deeper into this idea of mindful wealth. I've talked a lot about mindful wealth over the years, and it's something I identified a number of years ago when I was working with clients. I noticed that there was a distinct difference between certain clients. There were clients that seemed fulfilled and happy, and there were other clients that just seemed a little less so. Maybe they were not quite as fulfilled or not quite as happy, even if they were at the same level of wealth. And I think that it comes down to kind of two different pillars or two focuses, which the first is going to be the technical side. So what are those clients doing and how are they doing? And then the second part of that equation is going to be the emotional side. And for me, I think this really hits home because you can do all the building, you can do the nuts and bolts, but that doesn't necessarily lead to fulfillment and enjoyment. And I think when you combine those two things together, that's really where you get that success. And to me, I think that that's the most important thing. It's not so much the zeros behind the numbers in your bank account. It's more about also the fulfillment that you get from the work and the effort that you put in. And I think a lot about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if we think about it at the base level, we need to create an income, we need to have wealth to basically satisfy those basic needs, food, shelter, safe place to live, those sorts of things. And then we get above that and now it's doing things that allow us to have a little bit of a life of leisure, some other things that you can be afforded by having additional wealth. But it's the piece that I think that's at the top of that, which is this transcendence by way of your wealth, or you get to a point in your life where you allow your wealth to work for you rather you working for your wealth. And I think that's the piece that really sets a lot of these folks apart, is really getting into that top of the triangle of getting into the transcendence of wealth creation. And that to me is, I think, the pinnacle of what it means to be financially successful, is that you're no longer doing it for the wrong reasons and you're not trying to keep up with the Joneses. You're doing it to create impact, create a legacy. You're doing some really cool things with your wealth. And it's not that you need to have millions and millions or billions of dollars. You can do that with a modest amount of wealth. It can have huge lasting impacts. So let's dive into it. I'm going to break down these 4 powerful habits, and they're going to be kind of broken into these 2 specific pillars. So the first pillar is going to be the technical side of wealth success, or what I think of as building intelligently. And the first part of that is people that are living at or below their means, and they're doing this strategically. It's not that they're having this scarcity mindset about we've got to constantly be pinching pennies. And you see this in the Financial Independence Retire Early. A big idea around that is really consolidating, really getting skinny on what you're spending your money on. You got to retire as early as possible. And while we can learn a little bit about some of those skills, I think it's more important that we have to think about some of the nuts and bolts of living below your means or at your means, and then doing things strategically to help them build your wealth. And so what I look at is, avoiding that lifestyle creep. So you get the pay raise, you get the bonus, and instead of going and immediately splurging all of that money on maybe a liability, so you go out and buy something that requires some sort of a debt payment, you think about it strategically. So you're putting that money away, you're saving it, you're investing it. I think that that's the biggest thing from that, is you're building that asset base. And when you do that, there's some very fundamental things. You might have a budget. Now, what I do find is that a lot of people aren't working on a budget necessarily that are in this space, but they are very aware of how they're spending their money. And I think that to me is a huge element to building that wealth incrementally, is just being aware of where you're spending money. Because if you're kind of blinders on, you're just spending and spending and spending and spending, then you're not going to have a lot left over, and you're not going to allow yourself to have the asset base or build that asset base, because you're going to be constantly kind of working from behind. But when we think about living at or below your means, It's, making sure that you're saving money for those goals-based approaches. That's a big area that we focus on at 4 Points Wealth is, thinking about a goals-based approach. So what's the reason why we're doing this? What are we shooting for? Or in some cases, it's saving for the sake of saving once we've kind of taken care of some of those other aspects of it. So that's a big part. I think that that's a huge element and should definitely not be overlooked is just how you're managing your cash flow, how you're, where dollars are going strategically, and then thinking about, trying to buy things in the right way, whether you're upgrading a car, a house, just for the sake of doing that because it looks cool on your social media, or whether you're doing it strategically where you're actually doing it to create appreciation in that asset or some need and we have to sparse out the needs versus the wants. I've got a client story around this that great clients came to me a few years ago and they had things kind of all over the place and all they really needed to do is kind of button it up. And one of the things that was so cool about this couple is they had 2 young kids, successful jobs, but they were savers. They just had this inherent nature of being savers. But what they did and the work that we did together was we got all of that saving on a fast-tracked way to build wealth. Instead of disjointed investment strategies, we got an entire strategy around their 401ks, their brokerage accounts, their rollover IRAs, and we created this nice approach where we could see how all of these different assets interacted with each other, an investment strategy that was across the board. We could look at that goals-based approach. We can build that core strategy that we talk a lot about here at 4 Points Wealth. And from that, these folks were already going in the right direction and they're not even in their 40s really, and they built a really nice base to then take it to the next level. And one of the things that I always think about with them is they were going out and buying a new car, and what they strategically did is they didn't go out and buy the brand new car. They bought the vehicle they needed and they bought it used. And it wasn't about ego. It wasn't about, trying to be impressive at the kids' drop off at school. It was just because it was going to be a tool, a utility that they were going to be using. And I think that was really, really cool. But it's not like they just got a piece of junk. They got something that was nice, but they were mindful. They thought about the steps. They took the steps to be proactive and think about how they were going to be that buy this asset or, essentially buy a liability for buying a car, but what they were going to do. So a lot of thought, intention, mindfulness, these are some of the things that they applied to their financial lives and have been successful in their early part of their wealth journey. So I think I want to point that out. That's a really cool one for me. The second part of the technical side of wealth success and wealth creation is this idea around building assets, not liabilities. And this can be focusing on buying real estate or investments that have the opportunity for appreciation. And it's not about buying things that have some sort of a liability. And when I think about this, I often point to the Rich Dad, Poor Dad series. The whole idea around that was it didn't necessarily matter about education. The Rich Dad focused on building income producing assets that are going to grow over time, that have appreciation opportunities, that you can increase those rents when we're thinking about real estate. But this is, I think, a big aspect that I think early on our education system doesn't do a great job of. And I think just our culture, in some cases, we're talking about consumerism and buying more things and buying stuff. I see this with my kids all the time, is they want to go to the store and they want to buy a new stuffy or they want to buy a new toy. And that toy has a very short half-life for their enjoyment. It might be a week, it might be 2 weeks, and in some cases, it might be a month or 2 or 3. But at some point, they lose focus, they lose that cool factor, and that can be really detrimental. So that's like something that happens as a young child. And so it's our job as parents to help build that. And instead of, buying the new stuffy, you're going out there and buying a new mountain bike when you don't necessarily need that. Now, I will say I'm a little guilty of that from time to time. But this idea of building assets, not liabilities. When I say that, what I'm looking at is, taking your savings, and you're being disciplined about your savings, and then you're putting that savings in places that are going to serve you. So whether that's investing in the stock market, which is kind of our core competence here at 4 Points Wealth, or it's buying real estate, or it's buying cryptocurrency. But whatever you're doing it with a disciplined mindful, intentional approach. These are clients also that think about things that aren't just on the growth of an asset, which obviously is really important, but it's also thinking about tax strategy. If I put this dollar here, what's the tax implications of that? If we think about the IRS code, what does the IRS code tell us? We can look at it through a couple frames. One, you could look at it and tell us all the things that you can do to get in trouble, or you could look at it and kind of flip it on its head and say, well, let's think about this. Where does the IRS want us to invest dollars? And when I think about that, we start to think about the tax advantages of certain things. As an example, a business owner has a lot of tax advantages or tax benefits from being a business owner. Well, that's because the IRS has set up their tax code to favor that. And part of it is that we have an enterprising kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps type of mentality, a very entrepreneurial minded culture here in the United States. Another place that the IRS looks at and you get a lot of tax benefits from is going to be in real estate. So being a real estate owner, that can be a huge benefit, whether that's a commercial property or that is going to be a residential property. There's a whole host of tax advantages that you can get from owning real estate. We can look at using a Roth 401k. We can look at using a Roth IRA. You know, what's the benefits? What are the opportunities that you have when it comes to these types of focus? And this also breeds this idea of, for me, the best case for building these assets is that it comes from being consistent, and that the best results really come from being consistent, intentional, and mindful with those financial moves that you're ultimately making. And I think for me, that has been highlighted by a couple of clients. One specifically is one of my favorite stories and one of my longtime clients. He isn't college educated. He's just a good, hardworking guy. And kind of that blue collar mentality where, you know, he started building a career and building a business years ago. And it was in agriculture. And over the years, he just acquired more and more land. And then he had a business that was working on the land. And all of a sudden, at some point, he said, you know what, I'm going to be done with this. And during that period of time, guess what he also did? Started investing in real estate. So he had a bunch of rental properties. So he had a business that owned the land that it was operating within, and he had a bunch of rental properties. And this is a perfect example of the millionaire next door. The guy is very unassuming, not flashy, but he has millions and millions of dollars in assets because of all of the incremental, consistent work that he did over the years. And when time came, he decided to sell the business. So he sold the business, all right? But guess what? He still owned the land where the business was operated. So not only did he sell the business, then he got the rents from the business that he sold to then operate that business on the land that he owned. So after he left, he still got paid. And then finally the business decided to buy the land from him. So it was like he got to double dip on this opportunity, which was amazing. And then with the rental properties, now he still has those. He's able to depreciate those assets. And now he's starting to look at what is the opportunity to offload some of these assets. So it's just a matter of understanding the timing, understanding that it's not timing the market, it's timing in the market. That's the old Warren Buffett adage. But this doesn't just align with, you know, the stock market. It's also a part of all these other different parts of the financial markets. So those are the two things that I think from a technical standpoint are some of the biggest wealth creators is, you know, that idea of living below your means and then, you know, making sure that you're saving and doing all this stuff strategically. So using that cash flow. And then with that, once you kind of have that figured out, then start focusing on building assets and not liabilities. Let's just jump and spend some time over on the emotional side of wealth success. So with that, that's going to be an area that I think a lot of people don't spend a lot of time on and they overlook. And it seems very obvious, but at the end of the day, some people just don't really think about this idea of our emotional well-being tied to our wealth. And I think about this as living purposefully. And with a lot of people, if you aren't purpose-driven when it comes to wealth creation, you're gonna stop and not really understand what you're doing, or you're gonna try to get these get-rich-quick types of ideas. You want that punch, you want the stock that jumps 600% in 2 days or something like that. You're not really focused on what it takes to do the long game, you know, which frankly, building wealth is not that sexy. And it's not, if you just do the basic boring stuff, you're likely going to be really successful. But people don't want to put in that long, kind of meticulous and sometimes monotonous work that it takes to be successful in your financial lives. So the first thing of the emotional side is this purpose-driven piece. And I think for this is understanding your why. What are you doing? Why are you buying this or investing in that? Because if you're constantly shifting things around because you don't have focus on that why, then you're going to be constantly moving sand from one pocket to the other. And then every time you move the sand falls out of your hand a little bit at a time. And I see this with people that dive into businesses that they don't really understand, and then it wasn't successful in a very short time, and then they leave, and they oftentimes have to sell at a discount. This is people that are investing in individual stocks as an example, and they want to get rich and they want to get that thing that pops like 600% overnight, and it's acquired by this amazing company, and you end up walking away with the big bag of cash. Well, unfortunately, that just doesn't happen that often. And so when you have that reason why, or your why behind your wealth creation, I think is a huge element. So this is understanding, is that for legacy? Do you want to build that wealth for freedom? Maybe it's impact. These are all very good reasons to build wealth. And everybody's got their own thing, so I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong or you're right. It's just that you have to be okay with whatever you're doing. And I think about using wealth as a tool. And it's not as a tool for manipulation, it's a tool to serve you. And if you think about it in those terms, then all of a sudden you're going to be feeling much better about yourself. And I think that it's really valuable for a lot of people to spend some time thinking about the purpose, thinking about the values that they carry, and then why they should be applying those to their own personal financial situation. And again, I think with those people that have had that success, they are more mission and legacy focused. They have that purpose behind whatever they're doing. And I think about one client specifically because he went from wealth creation as a means to an end to wealth creation as a purpose-driven aspect. And it was really cool because he's been my client for a number of years, and I've known him personally for a lot longer. He was a corporate executive and life was great on the outside, but he was crumbling inside. He was making all the money, he had the nice car, the beautiful wife, the big house, and was doing all the things, but he wasn't satisfied inside. And it wasn't until he got out of the corporate world and started his own business, his professional life, it was focused on serving others and being very mission focused for that spirituality side of things, he became a much happier individual. So that then he allowed his wealth to kind of come with him, and he was more purpose driven. And so our conversations that we have are not so much around the exact percentage of, we have 34% in this particular asset class and 12% in that, and well, why aren't we balanced? It's more of, are we on the right trajectory? Are we moving in the right direction? Yes, the percentages matter. Yes, all of this stuff matters. But in the end, is the path that we're following, is that the right one that we want to be on? Because if it's not, then we probably ought to adjust our focus and maybe move in a different direction. And some of that it doesn't matter about your asset allocation. We have to think about it from a different frame. And now what I have found from him is that he is so much more calm about the decisions that he's making. He is looking at life through a different frame and a different lens. And his relationships with both the people in his life, his wife, his community has strengthened, and it has actually emboldened him to do more risky things for the sake of building this legacy. And it's really cool because he's very purpose driven in that conquest. And I think it's just a beautiful thing. I always try to help my clients understand why it's impactful to think about purpose and understanding your why behind why you want to build wealth in the first place. The next part of the emotional side is going to be this idea around growth mindset. So this is a part that I think has maybe gotten beat a little bit, and it's a little cliche, but we've talked and we've heard a lot about this growth mindset or having an abundance mindset. And this is obviously in conflict, or the other side of that coin is going to be the scarcity mindset. So having a growth mindset is this idea around being open to learning, evolving, and receiving guidance. And sometimes I think early on, and I think this is a lot of young men out there that are in their 30s and 40s, have this experience where they've got to carry it all. They've got to put the load on their back, and they've got to march, and the financial success is on their shoulders. And the reality is that's just not the case. We've got to be able to have this growth mindset that says, I need some help. And part of that is sometimes a helping hand. And it also thinks about bringing a team together. And this also then relates to so many other aspects of life. And when I see people with a growth mindset, this is a huge benefit on the fundamental side, which is, the technical side, is if you have a growth mindset, you're oftentimes going to have a much clearer head space when it comes to financial challenges, whether that's a job loss, an unforeseen circumstance, or maybe a market turmoil moment. If you've got a growth mindset, you're going to see that there's opportunity, and that instead of going to cash and being fearful, you're saying, hey, let's jump in, let's buy more. And I think about this with a lot of clients that are really skittish, that are really concerned, and it usually comes from this fear-based approach. So those clients that have more of that growth-based approach or that abundance mindset tend to be much more successful because they can weather the storms. They're much more resilient. They can ride through some of the waves that can be rocky. They can be stormy periods from a financial perspective. I think about the global financial crisis and think about all the challenges that have happened in that period of time. And the people that came out on the other side tended to be the people that had that growth mindset that said, you know what, this isn't just how it's going to be always. This is going to be something that's maybe short-lived, or at least a period, and that there's greener pastures and bluer skies on the other side. And I think about the best examples for clients are those with that idea around coaching. They tend to be agents of their own health. They feel that they are not victims. And one of the best stories that I have from a client, and it's just one example among dozens, I've got a younger client in their early 40s, and the husband has always been very much of an entrepreneurial mindset. He kind of is able to go from one thing to another, and then he takes advantage of the place that he is in a good way, in that he gets to learn. He thinks about this from a learning. What can I learn from this job experience? And he has all types of different experiences. He started a half dozen businesses. He's had failures along the way, and it's not that everything is a success. He's had businesses that have sold and then businesses that have folded. But yet at the end of the day, he's come out really successful because he's looked at it as not of a failure, but as an opportunity to learn. Very much similar. She's been part of a family business that they've been growing for years and years and years. And now she's stepping in and taking over some of the reins there. And from that perspective, she has this growth mindset that says, you know what, this has been a family-run business. This is how I'm going to impact it. I'm going to create and I'm going to put my own flair to this. And I think that these are aspects that are really important to building that growth mindset, and also then have this huge benefit from a financial side. And I think it's just, I guess the point here is that it's not just accumulating wealth. They grow into that person who can be a steward for it as well. So instead of working so hard for your wealth, you let your wealth work for you, and you have a very much of a growth mindset. And taking these two sides, which is the technical side and the emotional side, if you can combine these, you will, and I don't usually oftentimes say this, you will be financially successful. And it doesn't mean that you have the biggest bank account, maybe not, but you're gonna find so much more satisfaction. You're gonna find so much more enjoyment in life if you can combine these two, and you can basically take those and understand where they fit and then bring them together to create a really beautiful symbiotic relationship and really drive that forward. And I'm just the guide along the way. You are doing all the work and you're doing all the heavy lifting, but I'm just helping you along the way. I'm gonna help put those plans in place. You're gonna help you execute those plans, but at the end of the day, you're in control. You have agency over your lives. And if you can kind of take that approach, it's a really wonderful and really enjoyable place to be. And it's not without a little hard work. It's not without a little bit of grit, perseverance, and tenacity. But I promise that that's an area that I think people can see financial success if they can combine a strong technical foundation with a more enlightened emotional side for their financials. It's something that I thoroughly enjoy.